Imagine for a moment that you are a German fighter pilot in the autumn of 1943. You are sitting in the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190, a machine widely considered the finest radial engine fighter in the world. You are agile, you are fast, and you have spent years dominating the skies over France. You look in your rearview mirror and see a shape approaching. It does not look like a fighter. It looks like a milk bottle. It looks like a bathtub with wings. It is massive, twice the weight of your own aircraft. You laugh. Tell your wingman to watch as you turn inside this lumbering beast and shred it with your cannons. You pull the stick back, banking hard, expecting the American plane to fall behind, unable to match your turn. But then, something impossible happens. The beast does not try to turn. It does not try to dance. Instead, it tips its nose forward and drops. It drops faster than physics should allow. In seconds, it transforms from a clumsy giant into a 7-ton meteorite screaming towards the Earth at 500 miles per hour. You try to follow, but your controls stiffen. Your aircraft begins to shudder, threatening to tear itself apart in the slipstream. You watch, helpless, as the American plane vanishes into the clouds below, escaping a death trap that would have killed any other aircraft in history. And then, a minute later, you see it again. But it is not below you. It is behind you. It has used that terrifying dive to gain momentum, zooming back up into the stratosphere like a roller coaster car, trading speed for altitude until it is perched above you, ready to drop the hammer again. This was the moment the Luftwaffe realized they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that air combat was a fencing match, a duel of elegance and agility. They were wrong. The Americans had brought a sledgehammer to a sword fight. This is the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the most controversial, misunderstood, and devastating weapon of the European air war. It was a plane that pilots initially hated, commanders tried to cancel, and enemies learned to fear more than anything else in the sky. But to understand why this machine changed history, we have to understand why it shouldn't have worked at all. To fully grasp the anomaly that was the P-47, you must step back to the desperate days of 1941 and 1942. The Allied air war against Germany was failing. The Royal Air Force had the Supermarine Spitfire, a beautiful, graceful interceptor that could outturn almost anything. But it had a fatal flaw. It had short legs. It could barely cross the English Channel before running low on fuel. This meant that when American heavy bombers, the B-17, flying fortresses, flew deep into Germany to strike factories and rail yards, they were entirely alone. The Luftwaffe knew this. They waited until the Spitfires turned back at the French coast, and then they slaughtered the American bombers. The loss rates were catastrophic. The United States Army Air Forces faced a crisis that threatened to derail the entire war effort. If they couldn't protect their bombers, they couldn't destroy the German war machine. They needed an escort fighter, but not just any fighter. They needed a plane that could fly high, fly far, and survive in the thin, freezing air where the German interceptors lived. The prevailing wisdom of aviation design at the time favored light and tight. The Japanese Zero, its British Spitfire, the German Messerschmitt Bf-19. These were small, lightweight aircraft designed to turn on a dime. Every ounce of weight was considered an enemy. Enter Alexander Kartveli. He was a Georgian immigrant, a brilliant but eccentric engineer working for Republic Aviation. Kartveli looked at the problem and decided to ignore every rule in the book. He didn't care about turning radiuses. He didn't care about dogfighting. He cared about one thing: the engine. The heart of the problem was altitude. As you go higher, the air gets thinner, and engines lose power. To fight at 30,000 feet where the bombers flew, you needed a massive turbocharger to force-feed air into the engine. But turbochargers were huge. They required complex ductwork, intercoolers, and exhaust piping. Most designers tried to shrink these components to fit them into small airframes. Kartveli did the opposite. He designed the turbocharger system, first a massive, complex snake of pipes running the length of the fuselage, and then he essentially wrapped an airplane around it. The result was a monster. When the prototype XP-47B rolled out, it dwarfed everything on the tarmac. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, empty almost double the weight of a Spitfire. It stood on landing gear so tall that pilots had to climb a ladder just to get to the cockpit. It was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, a radial beast that produced 2,000 horsepower. The military brass was skeptical. Pilots were horrified. When the first American airmen in England saw the P-47 crates arriving, they thought it was a joke. They called it the Jug, short for juggernaut, because of its resemblance to a milk jug. They looked at its thick wings and massive fuselage and asked a simple question. How are we supposed to fight the Germans in this? It's a flying bathtub. This skepticism wasn't just complaining. It was a strategic crisis. The Allies were betting their air superiority on a plane that defied the fundamental logic of aerial warfare. If Cartvelli was wrong, the bomber offensive would fail, D-Day would be impossible, and the war in Europe could drag on for years. The debut of the Thunderbolt in early 1943 seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. The early missions were disasters. The radio equipment failed. The cockpits froze over. And when they encountered the enemy, the Germans ran circles around them. The Luftwaffe pilots flying nimble Focke-Wulf 190s quickly realized that if they dragged the P-47 into a turning feed-a-knife fight in a phone booth, the American plane was helpless. It bled energy in turns. It was sluggish at low speeds. The German aces began to view the P-47 as a target, not a threat. They would bait the Americans into turning, then slip behind them and open fire. Morale in the American fighter groups plummeted. Commanders like Don Blakesley openly campaigned to get rid of the P-47s and switch to Spitfires. But then the philosophy of the war began to shift. It started with a realization that came from desperation. Since the P-47 couldn't turn, pilots stopped trying. This is where the story pivots. We often think of military breakthroughs as new technology, but sometimes the breakthrough is simply a change in mindset. American commanders like Hubert Hub Zemp, a strict disciplinarian who ran the 56th Fighter Group, began to enforce a new doctrine. It was simple: do not turn. Zemp and other leaders realized that while the P-47 was heavy, that weight was actually a form of stored energy. Physics tells us that a heavy object falls faster and retains momentum longer than a light one. The P-47 was the fastest diving aircraft in the world. When a German pilot attacked, the P-47 pilot would simply push the nose down. The German would try to follow, but his lighter, more fragile plane would buffet and shake as it approached the speed of sound. The P-47, built like a tank, remained rock steady. Once the P-47 hit terminal velocity, the pilot would pull up. The kinetic energy from the dive would translate back into altitude, shooting the plane back up into the sky like a rocket. The German pilot, stuck at a lower altitude, could only watch as the Jug reset the engagement on its own terms. This was boom and zoom. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't pretty, but it was unbeatable. Then came the moment that changed the psychological landscape of the war. It wasn't a victory, it was a survival story. On June 26, 1943, Robert S. Johnson, a young American pilot, was jumped by a swarm of Focke-Wulfs. His plane was smashed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit. His canopy was shattered. He was trying to limp home when a German ace, likely Egan Meyer, spotted him. Barr pulled up behind the crippled Thunderbolt and unloaded his cannons. He fired rounds into the fuselage, the wings, the tail. He expected the American plane to explode. It didn't. Meyer flew alongside Johnson, looked at the shredding metal, shook his head in disbelief, and tried again. He emptied his machine guns into the P-47. The plane kept flying. The German ace, now out of ammunition, simply rocked his wings in a gesture of bewildered respect and peeled away. Johnson landed his plane in England with 21 separate 20mm cannon hits and over 200 bullet holes. When the photos of Johnson's plane circulated, the narrative changed. Pilots realized that while the Spitfire was a fencer that died from a single stab wound, the Thunderbolt was a medieval knight in full plate armor. You could beat it up, but you couldn't kill it. This confidence allowed American pilots to become more aggressive. They knew they could take a hit, to give a hit. The hit they gave was devastating. The P-47 carried 8 50-caliber machine guns. Most fighters carried 2 or 4. When a Thunderbolt fired, it wasn't shooting. It was disintegrating the air in front of it. A 2-second burst put 150 heavy rounds into the target. German planes didn't just crash when hit by a P-47, they evaporated. Throughout late 1943, the tide turned. The Wolfpack Zemsey's 56th Fighter Group began racking up kills. They weren't dogfighting, they were hunting. They patrolled high above the bomber streams, looking for the telltale contrails of German interceptors. When they spotted them, they didn't engage in a swirling melee. They dropped like anvils. The Battle of Schweinfurt and Regensburg was a grim awakening for the Luftwaffe. They sent their heavy destroyers, twin-engine Bf-110s, to attack the bombers with rockets, thinking they were safe at the rear of the formation. Suddenly, P-47s dove from the sun, tearing through the German formation before the enemy gunners could even track them. The hunter had become the hunted. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe faced a crisis. They had lost their sanctuary. The Americans were no longer just escorting bombers. They were sweeping the skies. And then the P-47 evolved again. The introduction of the paddle blade propeller utilized the massive horsepower of the engine more efficiently, allowing the Jug to climb almost as fast as the German interceptors. The one advantage the Germans had left, climb rate, was gone. It is easy to look back at the P-47's success and say it was inevitable. But that ignores the terrifying uncertainty of the time. The decision to keep building the Thunderbolt in 1942 was incredibly controversial. We have to credit the stubbornness of the Army Air Force's leadership. They were under immense pressure to switch to the P-38 Lightning or the P-51 Mustang exclusively. Strategically, sticking with the P-47 was a gamble on logistics over performance. The commanders made a cold calculation. A plane that brings the pilot home is worth more than a plane that has slightly better specs but breaks easily. This decision reveals a fundamental difference in how the Americans and Germans viewed war. The Germans sought the upper weapon, the perfect machine, the jet engine, the rocket. They were looking for a technological silver bullet. The Americans, conversely, sought the sustainable weapon. They wanted a plane that could be produced by the thousands, flown by pilots with average training, and survive the chaotic attrition of combat. The P-47 was the embodiment of the American way of war, massive, durable, and overwhelming. Historians still debate whether the earlier introduction of the P-51 Mustang would have ended the air war sooner. The Mustang had the range to go all the way to Berlin earlier than the P-47, however. I would argue that the P-47's specific brutality broke the spirit of the Luftwaffe in a way the Mustang didn't. When you shoot at an enemy and he doesn't die, it creates a psychological rot. German pilots began to feel that their technology was inferior, that their cannons were useless. That fear is a weapon as potent as any bomb. Furthermore, we must analyze the fighter-bomber transition. This is where the judgment of the commanders was truly tested. As the P-51 took over the high-altitude escort role in 1944, the P-47 was pushed down to the mud. This was a demotion in the eyes of the pilots. They wanted to be aces, not ground pounders. But the commanders knew that the P-47's air-cooled engine was the only thing that could survive ground fire. A single bullet in the radiator of a P-51 would seize the engine in minutes. A P-47 could have a cylinder shot off and keep flying. Sending these elite pilots to strafe tanks was a brutal use of resources, but it was the decision that paralyzed the German army in France. Here is something the history books rarely discuss, and the spec sheets never show. The sheer physical torture of flying the P-47 Thunderbolt. We tend to romanticize fighter pilots as effortless operators merging with their machines. But the P-47 was a truck without power steering, did not have the hydraulic boost controls that modern jets have. At high speeds, the air pressure flowing over the massive control surfaces was immense. To bank the plane or pull out of a dive required brute physical strength. Veterans of the 56th Fighter Group described coming back from a mission with their arms trembling so badly they could unhold a coffee cup. They weren't just mentally exhausted, they were physically shattered. Maneuvering a 7-ton aircraft at 400 miles per hour was like wrestling a bear for 4 hours straight. This created a specific type of pilot culture. P-47 wasn't a plane for the small or the delicate. It favored the linebackers, the farm boys, the heavyset men who could kick the rudder pedal with enough force to overcome the airflow.
Ow.
There are accounts of pilots having to use both hands on the stick and bracing their feet against the instrument panel just to pull out of a high-speed dive. If they failed, they would auger into the ground. This physical reality had a psychological side effect. You couldn't finesse a P-47, you had to dominate it. This bred an aggressive, bullying style of flying. P-47 pilots didn't dance, they smashed. This translated into their combat tactics. They became more willing to go head-to-head with German planes. In a head-on pass, where two planes fly directly at each other firing guns, the pilot who flinches first dies. P-47 pilots rarely flinched. They knew they were sitting behind a massive radial engine that acted as a shield, and they knew they had 8 guns to the Germans' 2 or 4. They used the sheer bulk of their plane as a psychological weapon to force the Germans to break away. Furthermore, there is an overlooked technical aspect to this physical struggle: the cockpit heating, or rather, the lack of it. At 30,000 feet, the temperature is 40 to 50 degrees below zero. The P-47's heater was notoriously unreliable. Pilots flew in electrically heated suits, but these often shorted out or failed. Frostbite was a legitimate combat casualty. Imagine trying to wrestle a 7-ton machine pulling 5 Gs. While your fingers are numb with frostbite and your oxygen mask is freezing to your face. This was the reality of the high-altitude war. It wasn't just a battle against the Luftwaffe. It was a battle against the environment and the machine itself. There is a tragic irony here. The P-47 was the safest plane in terms of surviving enemy fire, but it was one of the most demanding planes to fly. Many young pilots died not because a German shot them down, but because they simply lost the physical battle with the aircraft during a high-speed maneuver or a landing approach. The jug forgave battle damage, but it did not forgive weakness. This perspective changes how we view the victory. It wasn't just about superior engineering. It was about endurance. The American pilots who flew the P-47 to Berlin and back were performing an athletic feat that is hard to comprehend today. They were fighting a 4-OR wrestling match in a freezer, all while people were trying to kill them. That level of human endurance is the untold engine of the Allied victory. We must also zoom in on a specific technological detail that is often mentioned but rarely explained in its full strategic context: the paddle blade propeller. In late 1943, the P-47 seemed to have reached its peak. It was fast, but it climbed slowly. If a German pilot stayed high, he was safe. But then, almost overnight, the performance of the P-47 jumped. Suddenly, the giant planes were climbing like elevators. This wasn't a new engine, it was a new shape. Standard propellers were thin and tapered like knives. They sliced through the air efficiently, but didn't grab much of it. The new Curtiss electric paddle blades were wide, massive slabs of metal like canoe paddles. They were essentially air scoops. They allowed the massive 2,000 horsepower engine to bite into the thin air at high altitudes with much more force. The introduction of these propellers is a perfect example of the unseen war of engineering. To a German intelligence officer, the P-47 looked exactly the same. But in the air, the geometry of the fight had changed. German pilots would dive on a P-47, expecting to zoom back up and escape, only to find the fat American fighter clawing its way right up behind them, hanging on its prop. The shock of this cannot be overstated. It disrupted the entire tactical manual of the Luftwaffe. They had memorized the performance data of their enemy, but the data had changed without warning. This reveals a critical advantage of the American war machine: adaptability. The Germans were still flying variants of the Bf-109 that first flew in 1935. The Americans were upgrading their planes in the field, swapping parts, and radically altering performance in the middle of a campaign. The paddle blade was a relatively small change, just a piece of metal, but it unlocked the full potential of the P-47 airframe, transformed the plane from a diver into a climber, removing the last sanctuary the Luftwaffe had. As the war drew to a close in 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had ravaged the European continent. It had claimed nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and another 3,000 on the ground. But its most grim statistic was the destruction of over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 armored vehicles. It had systematically deconstructed the transportation network of the Third Reich. Yet, despite this dominance, the P-47 often fades into the background of popular history. Overshadowed by the glamorous P-51 Mustang, the Mustang was the racehorse. It was sexy, sleek, and photogenic. The Thunderbolt was the workhorse. It was scarred, dirty, and usually covered in mud. But we must remember that it was the Thunderbolt that held the line when the line was breaking. It was the Thunderbolt that taught the Luftwaffe that they were no longer safe in their own sky. And it was the Thunderbolt that brought thousands of American boys home who would have died in a more fragile aircraft. There was a famous story of a P-47 pilot who returned to base with half a wing missing and his engine on fire. He taxied to a stop, jumped out, and kissed the oil-stained cowling of his plane. That image captures the essence of this machine. It wasn't loved because it was beautiful. It was loved because it was a survivor. The legacy of the P-47 is not just in the battles it won, but in the philosophy it represented. It proved that in a total war, durability matters more than elegance. It showed that the ability to take a punch is just as important as the ability to throw one. Today, as we look at modern warfare with its stealth drones and electronic countermeasures, the P-47 seems like a relic from a different universe, but the lesson remains. Complexity is fragile. Simplicity, ruggedness, and overwhelming power have a quality all their own. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a hammer in a world of scalpels, and when the dust settled over Europe, it was the hammer that was still standing. History often remembers the swift and the sharp, but the story of the Thunderbolt reminds us to respect the strong and the stubborn. It was the iron fist that smashed the roof of Fortress Europe, letting the light of liberation pour in. And for the men who flew it, it was simply the greatest fry-end they ever had.